Next
Share.
up, we have Patrick Scully, and I'm going to say Jesi Carson, which I hope I'm saying it correctly, from Participedia. Now, their Participedia is not necessarily like, oh, it's all about participatory budgeting in schools, but it's this amazing resource that provides just a wealth of information and a wealth of opportunity for people who are caring about techniques associated with participation. And I reached out to them, and I'm very thankful that they're with us, because I think we're going to broaden our horizon of what is possible in this space through this conversation. So Jesi and Patrick, let me make sure that you're all ready to be co-hosts and you're ready to go. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Luke. We really appreciate that. It's great to be here. And thanks to all of you as well for being here. My name is Jesi Carson. You did pronounce it right. I'm Participedia's lead designer and communities coordinator. And I'm also now leading the design technology team for the project. I'll be presenting today with Patrick Scully, our managing director. I want to begin with land acknowledgement. I'm joining this conference from the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations peoples. That's in Vancouver, Canada. It's been a really difficult time lately in Canada, specifically around First Nations issues, with the discovery of 215 children, unidentified children, in an unmarked grave in the Kamloops residential school. So I just want to acknowledge that, so we don't forget that all children matter. And I encourage you to reflect on the lands where you are today as well. I'll begin with a brief overview of our agenda, which includes this welcome. Pat will introduce the Participedia Project, give you some history about that and what we're doing. I'll talk about how we co-designed our open source online platform, participedia.net. And then Pat will come back in to sort of connect what we do to, I think, what you're looking at in the conference in the FirstRoot tool and participatory budgeting in the broader context of democratic innovations. And Pat will close as well with that. We'll end with a fun little video as well. So there's lots to talk about today, and hopefully we'll have quite a bit of time for Q&A at the end as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Pat.
That's great. So it's great to be here. Thank you, Luke, for reaching out and sticking with us, even when I said, well, we don't really just do participatory budgeting, although we know it's one of the most important civic innovations, democratic innovations going on around the world right now. So we're not going to talk, as Luke suggested, at any length about participatory budgeting per se, but we hope we can give you a bit of context about how participatory budgeting fits into a larger universe of what some call democratic innovations. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I'm trying to stay away from jargon, and when I use it, I'm going to try to define it and explain to you what I mean by it. But first I want to talk, if you go to the next slide, please, Jesi. So we really are a global network of practitioners, researchers, all kinds of people looking at a wide variety of forms of public participation around the world. Now, what led us to do this, and by us actually, it was started by two professors, one, Arkan Fung at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and Mark Warren at the University of British Columbia. And they had met, as I had met them, at many other gatherings of the sort of democracy nerds who were interested in this stuff. And what was encouraging us to create, or what was encouraging Arkan and Mark to create Participedia back in 2009, was this explosion of all kinds of forms of new channels of citizen involvement and government. And it was happening in most countries throughout the world. It's probably not an overstatement to say that tens of thousands of them have been emerging over the last few decades. So we knew that a lot was happening, but we didn't know quite how we would capture it. It seemed that the scope was so large that even a really well-funded traditional research team, a handful of researchers, wouldn't be able to capture all the dynamics of what was happening around the world. So as an experiment, there was a first version of Participedia. And Jesi will talk in a few minutes, a little bit about how the project has evolved over time in terms of the technology that we've been using. But the long and the short of it is that we're trying to figure out how we could crowdsource this stuff. If you could go to the next slide there, Jesi. And so our goal really is to mobilize knowledge about democracy enhancing practices and institutions. It's very widespread that will support the answers to the question, what kinds of democratic innovations work best for what purposes and under what conditions? So for example, if you do a lot of this kind of work, you'll find that, for example, people might see something like participatory budgeting, great process that has evolved in many different forms over the last few decades. And that's really all they end up knowing about, but there's lots of other stuff. And the real question is, are you using the right innovation, the right process for the condition, the issues, and the condition in which you're working? So if you go to the next slide, Jess. So what do I mean by public participation? It sounds very plain spoken, so we're just trying to put a little bit of some boundaries around it. So you see here, it includes a range of processes that bring people together to learn about, discuss, and act on public issues. And I would say funding within schools and within school districts is definitely a public issue. We go to the next slide. So there's other kinds of terms as you get more involved in this kind of work, and there are important but small distinctions. But just this is a little, if you'll excuse me, a little bit of an introduction to the jargon. So other kinds of things you'll hear that are very similar to the kinds of things that we're investigating: citizen engagement, public engagement, participatory governance, participatory democracy, participatory engagement, deliberative democracy is one of the most popular ones these days. So if you go to the next slide, we've focused, and we're actually having a bit of an internal debate. We had a conference 2 weeks ago, kicking off a new phase of the project that I'll talk about a little bit later. And we spent actually about an hour just talking about what the heck does this mean? But for now, a sort of baseline definition, as I say here, it's an evolving concept. And within the context of public participation, what it means is that it's something that involves everyday people and problem solving and decision making about shared challenges. So not only activists, it doesn't exclude anybody, but it also isn't just for, say, issue activists on a particular issue. It tries to bring people together as a community using public participation methods that are relatively new to a context or place. Again, when I look at, say, what FirstRoot is doing in schools, yes, there are other people who are have been trying and experimenting with participatory budgeting in schools. And so FirstRoot is sort of building on that and trying to create a new way to do it. So in that sense, it is another innovation in the work. And the other piece that puts it really together is that it's trying to advance democratic values as collective action, inclusion. Democratic values such as collective action, inclusion, trust, and respect. So thanks, Jesi. Go to the next one. So, as I said, there's all kinds of things going on, and Jesi will just, when you see the map on the site, if you've not been to it before, and I really hope you will after this presentation, what we're trying to do is map what's going on around the world, even if it's the basics of what's the name of the initiative that's happening and where is it taking place. As we get into it more deeply, we want to understand how and why it works. We want to be able to figure out what difference is it making. Not only what outputs is it having, but what outcomes is it creating. And I appreciate it again on your site, Luke, the thoughtful piece you had about the challenges between outcomes or outputs and outcomes. That is, like, what are the sort of short-term deliverables that come out of a project, but what are the longer-term changes that can really be sustained in terms of outcomes. Based on those lessons, we want to be able to transfer this knowledge about what works best for which issues in which context. We want to transfer this knowledge because these are primarily researchers on the project, although we are gaining more and more practitioners as part of it, to transfer this knowledge into practice so that people can improve their work. And the other thing is, just across social science, This is an experiment in new ways of collaborating in the social sciences. So we have not only political scientists and political theorists, we have geographers, we have historians, you name it. So Jesse, if you can go to the next. So again, why we're trying to do this through crowdsourcing, we looked at it is, again, because there's so much going on that it just seemed like we were going to miss an awful lot if we didn't try to get everyday people who weren't necessarily experts in the field. They may have just attended something and thought, oh, that was cool. Eventually, if we get enough traction on the project and people recognize it the way, say, you might recognize Wikipedia, that they'll go up and they'll put some information on here. And I'm hoping that as you learn more about this and study it, that as people doing FirstRoot projects in their schools, at their school districts, anybody can get a sign on, get an account, and they can do a write-up of what they did and put it on the site.
Do you have I have to ask real quickly, do you have any form of an API or other form of automation? Because at the scale that we're anticipating operating at, I don't know if I know for sure we couldn't do it manually. We could add it as part of our checklist of implementation. So Clint, let's take a note on our implementation checklist to say, as part of your full implementation, share your results on Participedia. That's an easy thing to do. But we could also automate that if we had certain capabilities, and we can just table that. But I agree that it's fundamentally in everyone's best interest to create a durable record of participation.
I'll just add, Luke, that's high on our agenda as for the tech team. We have about 3 or 4 other projects in different fields that also, we do have an API, we just haven't publicly exposed it yet, but that's something that we're planning on doing. So we'll be in touch about that.
Yeah, please. And note that one thing that's interesting about our platform right off the bat, and this came from a student, is the proposals in our platform from the moment they're created are permalinked with durable URLs. And that was a student request saying, look, I want to put on my college application that I created, I participated, and in fact, my idea got selected. I want to share that. I'm really proud of what we were able to do. So we immediately did some back-end redesign work, and we made sure that all proposals, all PB cycles are all permanent, Duralinks on the web.
It's a good idea. We find that a lot of students end up showing their Participedia profile pages to prospective employers after they're done school to show the cases they published as well. It's so true. It's such a good motivation.
Yeah.
And good to have
it's not for everyone, right? But for the kids, for the youth who want it, why not? I mean, we're not anticipating everyone's going to do that, but that's okay.
Exactly.
Right? Oh, this is brilliant. Thanks. Sorry for jumping in, but I think that for us, having that post voting implementation phase, there's also a celebration. You have to celebrate that you spent money, and I'm going to go with our pockets change friends, right? You want to celebrate that you spent money making the school better. Mm-hmm. Have a little party.
Yeah, that's great. There was a great time to intervene and ask that question, Luke, because I was about to hand it back to Jesse. She's going to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the site and how it was developed.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Pat. Yeah, so I'll introduce you to our crowdsourcing platform. Like Pat said, we're a global network, but we also have this collective tool that we all use together and the public uses. It's an open source crowdsourcing platform, which is designed to collect and share knowledge and data about public participation and democratic innovation. So all those things Pat was just talking about, we've sort of formalized that into a platform to collect information, a lot like Wikipedia, hence the name. So anyone can contribute to participedia.net by clicking the quick submit button at the top of the site. We crowdsource entries about cases, methods, and organizations. Each of these 3 types of entries has a data form where you can fill in as much or little about the entry as you know about the innovation. And the quick submit form asks just a few basic questions and creates what we would call like a starter entry or a stub that other people can add to later. And the form also has a full version option, so you can come back and add more data as well as you find out more or as other researchers add to it. But to give you just a sense of the kinds of entries you might find on the site, I've chosen just a couple of cases to highlight really the diversity of these civic events and actions that we are seeing. So this slide is showing participatory slum upgrading in Buenos Aires, and this describes just an inclusive process for housing security, and this is like collaborative urban planning. Another slide here, we see the Women's March of 2017, which is one of many examples of like large scale grassroots organizing. So there's other big protests as well that you can find on the site. This case is an example of participatory budgeting in a high school in Arizona in the United States. There's a pretty big handful of cases about PB in schools on the site and like hundreds of PB examples in general. I'll talk a bit more about how to do searching and stuff in a minute too. So, I mean, this is a COVID case, and really the thing about having a crowdsourcing platform is that it creates this historic archive, but it's also a great opportunity to like rapidly document what's going on in the world. So when COVID hit, we were able to quickly document many responses that were popping up all over the world in response to the pandemic. This slide shows the public singing that started happening early on in the pandemic in support of health workers and frontline workers. So yeah, we built this collections feature just before COVID. Actually, we had launched it after working with the Privy Council of the Government of Canada, who worked with us to publish a series of case studies about their work in Canada, but they wanted a way to showcase those 5 cases that they made as a kind of a unique subset of our larger data set. So that inspired this feature where we can now site administrators can group entries together and create collections that share common traits, such as like association with a large scale initiative or an institution or a specific topic like COVID. The collections feature was really central to rapidly documenting those responses to COVID, and our Citizens' Voices and Values collection, Values on COVID-19 collection, is now being referenced in a study that's undertaken by the UN. And this is also showing the Black Lives Matter movement. After the killing of George Floyd, we created a collection to centralize data about racial justice initiatives using collections too. And you can also now download a CSV file containing the data about each collection. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Before I go into sort of tutorials about the site, I'll give you a bit of a history about the evolution of the platform and the way that we co-designed it together as a community. So Participedia's very first iteration was built on MediaWiki, which is the same open source software that powers Wikipedia. Then in 2011, they launched a kind of redesigned alpha version of Participedia, which was built by a private development firm, and they owned the code internally. And it was a great project. It created a bunch of cases. It looked better than the original, but we identified an issue when we got a new round of grant funding was that development firm couldn't support the level of student mentorship that we wanted to foster in this next phase of the project. So because of that, this design and technology team that I'm a part of was formed and determined that to support student mentorship, we really needed to shift away from that kind of traditional client service model of web development. And because of that, we implemented an open source approach that was built in-house. So this transition from closed source to open source took place starting around in 2015 till now, when we relaunched in about 2018 with an open source site. And the new version that you see now of Participedia was really collaboratively envisioned with this community of researchers and our audiences to decide, what features are most important. And then the platform itself was largely designed and built by students, which we thought was pretty important, given the educational aims of the project. So early on in this co-design process, we made the hypothesis that a project about public participation should itself be participatory. And we took concrete steps to make the design process more participatory and inclusive. So first, as I mentioned, the shift from closed to open source was important, but it did require us to build a brand new site from the ground up. But at the same time, it also enabled us to build an in-house team that is women-led and inclusive and sets a positive example in the tech sector where women are still quite underrepresented. And our design tech team intentionally hired and created mentorship opportunities for women of color, LGBTQ plus technologists and designers. And we used a collaborative platform called GitHub to provide open source access to this new code base that we made. So the second step to make the platform and the project more participatory was to really do a lot of co-design activities with the people involved and identify issues and biases by engaging dialogue and actively incorporating feedback from this community, which was really multidisciplinary. And so this allowed us to ensure a diversity of perspectives in the design. So one example of a change that came out of this process is the data model itself. Early versions of the data that were collected on the site were quite weighted to North American and European contexts. And so since then, the research team and others on the project have worked together to make the data model more inclusive of the global South. Of course, it's definitely not perfect still, and it's a work in progress that we're continuing to improve over time. So the last thing I'll mention is that we designed specific features on the site to be more accessible, not only to a general audience, but also to remote and underserved communities. So a couple of quick examples of that are that the old platform you couldn't access on a phone, and now you can. It's mobile responsive, so you can access it in remote areas on mobile devices. And then we implemented multi-language functionality to ensure or facilitate rather a global knowledge exchange. And we updated, like, as I mentioned, the data model to be more diverse as well. So I'll just end my little spiel here with the sort of three main things that we hope that people will do as part of
sorry, I got to jump in on that.
Please, yes.
If you don't mind. We spend a lot of time data modeling, and that's my personal geek background, is in a lot of data modeling and data warehousing. So I'm a big fan of things like David Hayes' data model patterns or Mountain Fowler's work on analysis patterns. And so one question, I mean, I find it curious that because we know that algorithms have bias and such things as, you know, the training sets of the data and things like that. I am very curious to understand if you could unpack some of the statements you made a little bit more about the data model. My team knows that one thing that drives me nuts is I haven't found a good way to crack the code of multiple surnames in data modeling and access, because you want to be respectful of how people identify themselves and how their culture works. And you want to balance that with accessibility and other things. And so, you know, and you can go into identity management and things like that, but I'd be very curious to let you share, if you don't mind, some of that insight that you got, because that sounds like a pretty hard life lesson that's pretty valuable.
Pat, I wonder if you want to share some of the process of the research team.
Yeah, that's interesting. It brought a smile on my face, Luke, when you mentioned the challenges around surnames, because when you said that, I realized, yeah, that's a big challenge. And I don't know that, you know, I was looking at it more from a practitioner in this field and the theorist, and didn't pay much attention to that. So that's why it's good to have other people looking at it. But how we developed it, for the most part, we have had similar kinds of problems in other ways. So there was a first rudimentary data model that was created by Archon Fung and Mark Warren. That was the one that they built on MediaWiki. In the next iteration, basically what we did is we had a group of, at any given time, between half a dozen and a dozen people who met regularly, and we were, just on Google Docs and spreadsheets, talking about what were the categories that we needed to collect information in, looking at other data models, what different varieties, how granular was it useful to get?
Yeah, like are you talking about like structured versus unstructured content, right, and those kinds of choices? Yeah, that's a really interesting field that we also struggle with, because the proposal idea of a student in participatory budgeting should be light and fast and inclusive, but the implementation details necessary to actually determine viability and feasibility of an actual implementation of that idea needs to have a fairly rich set of data. So what we're probably going to be doing is doing some form of progressive profiling through the PB cycle, where attributes would be dynamically available as the proposal warranted them, or as interest suggested that more attributes are now appropriate for decision-making purposes.
That sounds really interesting. I don't know if we've got the budget to build that yet.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean,
but it sounds awesome. And I know
I'm talking about dreams here. But
totally
if
aspirational. It sounds amazing.
And if
That's interesting, Luke.
Yeah. The progressive profiling is also associated with the field of market research. So you can look at that field to get ideas of how they do it. I'm sorry, Pat.
Yeah, absolutely. And we certainly struggled with the length of that form, and just like the user experience versus how many questions to ask versus how diverse these innovations are. It's this constant balancing act, which is why we launched the quick submit version of the form, which is like a limited version. So there's like 5 questions. We decided, among the team, which questions are the most important to create these stub entries, which are basic, but at least you get the multitude of entries, and some of them are long and entered in more depth, and then some of them are short. So it was just like, it's this barrier to entry that someone sees this massive thing and they can't even fathom filling it all in. So we're like, hey, take it all away. What's the minimum viable product here, to use marketing terms again?
Right, and in terms of the quality control around that, so we say this is crowdsourced, but in truth, it is sort of crowdsourced plus.
Right.
So the grants that we have received, most of the funds have come from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and in turn, about close to a third of the funds that we've received. I'll say a little bit more about this in a few minutes. Our second large grant, they have these things called partnership grants. There are multiple organizations, global projects, and they were $2.5 million Canadian, which is about 2.1, I guess.
Yeah.
Dollars. Yeah. Anyway, but about a third of that for each grant is dedicated to hiring students, undergraduates and graduate students and doctoral students. And a lot of what they do is they learn about everything. Actually, the second data model that we designed was really spearheaded work on. It was spearheaded by a doctoral candidate at the time, who was at UBC, with other senior people working with them. So that is to say that we have students who go in and they review the content to help flesh it out. Or there'll be a buzz around something that's going on, or a certain kind of work that's going on, and you can apply student power energy to that to flesh it out. So yeah, it's hard, but I think it sounds like we will be wanting to talk with you a little bit about the data modeling process at another time. Luke, about
we could take that offline, but there's other, we worry about, I think we worry about a lot of similar things expressed in a slightly different domain than you do. Like, how do we make sure our content submission process is safe? So things like students can upload photos, but they're routed to Amazon image recognition to do a quick check on appropriateness before it even goes further. And, this notion of lightly curated stuff is essential, right? To safety.
For sure.
Psychological safety, inclusive safety. So anyway, I'll let you keep going, but it was just when you said that, my team is probably smiling or laughing out loud because they know I'm always talking about, the data, right?
Totally. Yep. It's a real thing. The struggle is real.
The struggle is real.
For sure. On the safety, just one last point on that reminded me as well of in terms of safety is like, I don't know if Pat, we haven't talked about this yet, but in the next phase of Participedia, we're expanding into these new research areas, including human rights. And there's going to be some data that's more sensitive and maybe not safe for public, publishing on a crowdsourcing site that could expose people or put people in danger. So that's something that we're facing as well as a technological issue and challenge going into the next phase of the project. So we don't have a solution yet. We use Dataverse, which does have like protected access to data and things like that. So we have prototype methods, but we haven't figured out what we're going to build yet. So anyway, lots to think about as we move along.
Have you looked at Benentech?
No, but thanks.
Okay, so you might want to look at Benentech .org. Among other things, they're known for building extremely secure software for human rights violation reporting and other kinds of things. So they build lots of really, human rights stuff that is very tricky, secure data and very secure access. And, how do we get reports of violations without putting people at harm from digital access? So you might want to, they have some really interesting practices that they work on.
Amazing. Thanks for the tip. We'll
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Good
Cool.
people.
All right, so we're good here. I'm just going to mention like our 3 big calls to action that we hope people will do to engage with the site and with our community. So first of all, this is what you'll see on our homepage. Below the big image there is these kind of 3 things: explore, contribute, and teach. So first of all, we ask people to simply explore the database of cases, methods, and organizations by using search and download features to access this data. And we just got these tutorial videos made, which is exciting. So I'm going to play them for you. They're very short. And it just tells you how to do each of these things. So I'll start with this one.
In this video, you'll learn how to search and download data on Participedia.net. Participedia is a crowdsourced database of thousands of examples of public participation and democratic innovations around the world. This data is used by academic and policy researchers and provides a rich source of engagement inspiration for practitioners and community organizers in multiple languages. Select your language here. Anyone can publish and edit content on Participedia. See our Help and Contact menu for more about the types of entries in the dataset, along with other useful tips. To access the data, enter keywords in the search bar or select an entry type. Results are displayed on the search page. You can sort search results and find curated collections of entries by navigating between these tabs. Use search filters to find examples of democratic innovations that match your interests. These filters represent a sample of the many data tags used to organize Participedia entries, which are published by contributors using our quick submit forms. Clicking the Download Results button will automatically download a CSV file for the search results displayed on the search page. If you want the whole dataset, clear your search and click the Download button again. On our research page, you can download the full dataset and codebooks. You'll also find links to research papers and Participedia's data analysis guidebook. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to email info@participedia.net, and please follow us on social media.
Okay, so next, our second call to action is for people to contribute to Participedia.net by publishing and editing entries. And here's one more video, and these are going to be on our Getting Started page soon, but you're the very first to see them in a public setting. There we go.
In this video, you'll learn how to publish and edit on Participedia.net. Participedia's database currently collects 3 types of crowdsourced entries: cases, methods, and organizations. Case entries document specific examples of how a participatory process has been implemented. Method entries provide detailed, practical aspects of how participatory designs work. Organization entries describe formal or informal groups that design, support, and implement participatory democratic innovations. If you're interested in editing, use the Entry Completeness search filter to find entries that need work. When viewing an entry, click the Edit button to make changes. Everyone is welcome to contribute. You'll need to create a user account to make edits or to publish a new entry, but it only takes a moment. Your contribution history will be found on your profile page. Try a quick search to see if an entry already exists before publishing a new one. Then click the Quick Submit button and select an entry type. Remember to use the site in your preferred language. When new entries are first published, they are automatically translated into multiple languages. Visit our FAQ page for more on how translation works. In the Quick Submit form, enter a few key details about a participatory initiative. You can come back later and do the full version. If you don't have all the data, that's okay, since anyone can edit and complete entries over time. See the Getting Started page for more tips on publishing and editing, and links to more detailed guidelines. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to email info@participedia.net.
All right. So finally, our last call to action is teach. And really because our community includes a lot of educators and people in universities and teachers, we really encourage people to use Participedia in the classroom. And many of our partners do this. And we've also created a place for people to share resources when teaching with Participedia. And so our teaching page offers this Teaching and Learning Resource Center, which is kind of a prototype. We haven't built like anything fancy. It's powered by Google Docs. But anyone there can upload and access lesson plans and assignments and rubrics. And it's not just for using Participedia in the classroom, but it's also like democratic teaching methods and participatory ways of engaging students. So there's lots there. Most of the resources have been designed for undergraduate level and higher, or for professional settings like professional development, but likely many of them can be adapted for the high school setting. So if this is of interest to you, please check out the Resource Center. And if you do end up practicing participatory budgeting in the classroom, we would encourage you to upload lesson plans or assignments, anything that you feel comfortable sharing as part of this kind of global knowledge commons participatory democratic teaching. And of course, you can also publish cases about your classes on Participedia too. So yeah, I'll pass it to Pat again to wrap us up.
That's great, Jesi. Thank you. So actually, I'm going to build on what Jesi was just saying. Again, as I was reading through some of the articles, the blog posts, et cetera, that you point to resources on FirstRoot, I was happy to see reinforcement of something that was bubbling up in my mind as I read this. And that is the relationship of financial literacy to civic literacy. So as an example, now we all, particularly in the US, but this is really happening around the world, we're seeing all kinds of challenges to democratic values, democratic practices, various forms of populism that are anti-democratic. Not that all populism is anti-democratic, but there are forms that are out there. There is what they're calling sort of democratic backsliding. And while there's always been a concern, I shouldn't say always, but for decades, as long as I've been following it, for at least 40 years, there is an ongoing concern. Are we giving the next generation the tools, the resources, the experiences they need to be fully participating people with a sense of agency, jargon, for that they have the power to make a change? This is just from a few years ago. I just highlighted this one. I think I saw pointed, you guys pointed to it as a footnote on one of the papers on the FirstRoot site, but I also happen to have known one of the authors, Peter Levine, for quite some time, and I really admire his work. Jesi, if you can go to the next slide. So what do we mean though by civic literacy? So this is, I was poking around because there's lots of ways to talk about it. I thought this one was one of the, at the least amount of jargon of many that I saw that I liked. The knowledge and skills to participate effectively in civic life through knowing how to stay informed, understanding governmental processes, and knowing how to exercise the rights and obligations of citizenship at local, state, national, and global levels. So I see the kind of work that can be done in participatory budgeting in high schools and school districts, when young people are allowed to be part of that, is a wonderful example of giving a hands-on experience for people. I think it's probably ideal. And I don't know, Luke, I haven't looked enough at your material, whether some teachers and faculty are building other experiences or other lesson plans around those experiences to see how it connects to other ways they can be involved. But if you go to the next slide, Jesi, please. This was one of my takeaways. It is quite clear that financial literacy can support a broader sense of civic literacy, a broader experience of civic literacy. So it's not only, not that that's not important, but it's not only learning how to better handle your own personal funds and finances, which is very important for young people, it's important for all of us, but it introduces you to how do we make collective decisions, how do we have dialogue about them, how do we debate, how do we deliberate about the trade-offs that we need to make when we have limited resources and how best to use them. And that is one of the fundamental touch points of making decisions together in a democratic context. So I think it's a great way to do it. And I would like to say, for if you get maybe to the level of AP civics, there's a lot of resources on Participedia as well that can introduce teachers and students to, and even once they get excited by using participatory budgeting in their school, there are other methods that they may want to look into, particularly as they're preparing to go into their higher education. So it's a growing and expanding field. So I guess I'm just going to say a few words about where we are in the phase of this project. So this project, as I mentioned earlier, started in 2009, really on a shoestring and a prayer. I think that Archon Fung and Mark Warren had a little bit of money stashed away. 2000, their department has hired a graduate student to build them the first media wiki site. A couple years later, they were able to raise a relatively small grant from the Canadian government for about $200,000, and then they had the larger one. And then we've had small pots of money from a few other foundations. We recently, though, we were fortunate, and this happens, I guess, not very often at all in Canada. The Social Science and Humanities Research Council provided Participedia with a second partnership grant. The new lead investigator, we are very happy to say, you'll see him on a video in a minute, is Bonnie Abawa at McMaster University. He is a historian. His specialty is human rights and global human rights. And as part of the new project, the new team has, as of now, there are 63 researchers who are formally part of this grant-funded project, 22 universities, 21 NGOs across 12 countries. So it's an ambitious plan. And as Jesi mentioned, we are going to be building on top of the participatory governance focus we've had to also look at issues of human rights, democratic accountability, democratic representation, democracy across borders, and democracy and digital communications. And there will be separate research teams. We're trying not to silo them. So we're going to be working across teams. There will be 6 different research clusters. And then our core team will help them communicate with each other. And going back to data modeling, Jesi and her team are going to be very busy for the next 18 months, working with the researchers in terms of using design principles to help them see how do they want to collect the data. Is it going to look the way we're doing it now? Is it going to look different? They have different questions. What models are they going to use? So that's where we're going, and that's our charge for the next 5 years.
Thanks, Pat. So we'll end by playing a short video of the project.
I believe that democracy is facing its greatest threat since the end of the Second World War. There are forces that are threatening to erode our democratic principles and values across the world. Xenophobia, inequalities within and between nations, rising forms of populist nationalism, the disruptions of COVID-19 pandemic. Participedia responds to these challenges in democracy by mobilizing knowledge to defend and expand democracy around the world.
Participedia has produced a platform that allows us to very rapidly gather and map emerging democratic innovations. For example, in Cape Town, in South Africa, Black Sash works with very marginalized communities to develop the capacity to ask the state why it is not providing basic social services. The sort of north-south binary, I think, is being shifted in Participedia towards a more global perspective and towards a framework of mutual learning.
We're especially interested in Participedia in understanding what kinds of innovations work for what types of issues, when, where, under what conditions, trying to figure out how to translate democratic innovations that work in one context to new contexts.
Participedia offers a large array of experiences and ideas and proposals and experiments covering over 1,800 cases and 330 method entries all around the world on every policy issue and public problem almost that you can imagine. The Participedia platform has generated more than 2,000 active users who are contributing and engaging with content.
Participedia has a very exciting design team, women-led and women-driven.
The designer, developer, we are all women and all inclusive. The data are public, the code is stored publicly. We use a lot of open source technology. It's not just our team that get a chance to making Participedia better. Anyone could.
Participedia is useful for practitioners. In terms of accessibility, Participedia really allows for just anybody to look up how to do something in their community.
We've got a really exciting opportunity here to build a very long-lasting community of democracy practitioners and activists and researchers who can sustain democracy in the long term.
The vision is to make Participedia the global classroom for democratic innovation that all sectors of our local and international community can use.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
So questions, comments?
Wow, what
You
an
can jump in the chat too if you want to. If you want to say something in the chat, please go ahead, or just jump in.
I just wanted to say what an incredibly powerful video, you know, and message. We talk a lot about democracy at FirstRoot. We talk a lot about, you know, we even consider, you know, is it democracy that do we position ourselves as a organization that is teaching children to trust in and use the democratic process in their everyday lives, right? Are we an organization that is focused on financial literacy, right? We're a for-profit organization. We need financial backers, right, to do what we do. And it's hard, and we know that it's hard for investors to maintain, you know, investors need to see a single face in a sense, right? They're like, well, what is it? What is the thing that you do? And we're like, well, we do this and we do, and they're like, nope, how are you positioning yourself? I really love that, you know, that you have very, you know, I mean, clearly you do something that is different than us, right? And you are very directly positioned in the stream of democracy, which is so extremely important around the world. And I wouldn't say just now, but, you know, continues to be. I think one of the things that is unique about this time now is that there is that the nations that have benefited from democracy have, in a sense, lulled themselves into not quite recognizing how the benefits of the democracy that they're living in, right? They don't quite recognize that the luxuries that they have are the result of others who fought very, very hard to obtain a democracy and to sustain a democracy. As the democratic process, in the United States, the democratic process is eroded to more of like a corporatist, process, et cetera. It's not easy for people to recognize the signs of a degraded, democratic process, if you will. So I just wanted to say bravo, because it is so incredible to, we do talk about these things every day, literally, Luke and I, sometimes loudly, about, democracy and financial literacy and, which side of the fence do we think, honestly, when we walk into a school, it's one experience, whether you're, kids will learn financial literacy and they will learn democracy through this participatory budgeting process. They're just gonna learn, and you can teach both at the same time, right? So I just want to, I don't know, I'm so inspired by what you do, and so inspired by your vision. I really look forward to maintaining a relationship and digging in deeper into your platform. So thank you. I have no questions. I'm sorry.
Just a quick response on that, Clint. Thank you for that. I think you're right on target with your observations, particularly about. It's interesting. There are a lot of people working in this field before the events of the last 5 or 6 years that we've seen, where it said, "Oh, these countries say, let's not talk about the U.S. Let's talk about, say, in former what we call Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc." Of some places that I, for example, did a Fulbright in Budapest, Hungary, shortly after the fall of communism in the early 90s, and it was so everybody was, "Oh, this is going to be a great, robust democracy," and they've fallen way far back from that. So it's once you become democratic, you don't necessarily stay a democracy. So it's a challenge. One quick thing, whether or not you have already scoped out this landscape, it really is not Participedia landscape. Well, it is to some extent, but I think there are a range of other more practitioner types, most of whom are foundation funded, who are doing other school-based programs that complement what you're doing, or that yours work would complement theirs. So I'm thinking, for example, of some work that the Nellie Mae Foundation, based up in Massachusetts, has done around student-centered learning and getting students more involved in making decisions in their schools. It's not an area that I know much about, but I know other people who do know more about it.
Okay, so I wrote down Nellie Mae, which is really good. And then the only one I'm going to make sure we get into, I think, if I can, in my prior job, in my last company, I created a strategic partnership with the Kettering Foundation.
Oh.
And if you've heard of Common Ground for Action, which is their web-based platform, I built that.
Oh, you built that?
I built that platform.
I worked at Kettering for 9 years, from 85 to 93.
So Amy Lee was
who's now at OSU.
Yeah, now at OSU, but she's like my dear friend, and Brad Rourke. So Amy
That's
Lee,
funny. I know both of them very well. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So what was funny about that connection? Sorry, everyone. I know I'm co-opting a little bit of, just social networking, but I gave a talk at I gave a keynote at South by Southwest on participatory budgeting and the work we were doing in San Jose in 2012. and Amy Lee walked up to me and said, "Hey, I'm from Kettering, and this is what we work on." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, I know how to build that kind of software. Do you want to put it online? And Amy's like, "Well, you can't put deliberation online." I'm like, "I think you can."
Mm-hmm.
And it was my team that built that for Kettering.
Very interesting. Good job.
Wow.
It's being used a lot now.
Well, it got transferred as an asset to Every Voice Engaged Foundation. And I put in a CEO to run it so I could do this. So I've split the focus of the organization. So Every Voice Engaged is focused squarely on deliberative decision-making and can focus. And our focus is on this really absolutely vital, and I'm going to rope in Pockets Change again, it's this absolutely vital relationship between life skill of financial literacy and life skill of civic engagement versus the technical training that's dominating our educational institutions like calculus and sentence structure. So I looked at your background and I thought, okay, I'm going to throw out the Kettering stuff because I think it'd be fun. But we really care about this kind of capability and this kind of infrastructure.
Cool. Great. Thank you, Luke. That's very good.
And yeah, and Amy is super cool and Brad is super cool. And the work is just great stuff. Okay, we've got literally 5 minutes left. I'm going to turn this around, and I haven't done this yet. Do you have a question or a concern about what we might be doing based on the work that you've done and looking at our website and learning about us? Like, do you have any question? I mean, we've been badgering our presenters with endless questions, but I thought I'd turn it around for a moment and say, do you have something that you would want to ask us or a concern that you might want to share so that we can address it and make sure that we're not falling prey into any bad habit or bad, even with good intention, bad outcome?
Did you want to go first, Jesse, or?
I'm not sure. I'll have to think a minute, but I mean, yeah, well, I'll be honest. Okay, the first thing I thought was, oh, is this a conference to promote a piece of software? Like, what is this? But I actually feel like there's a lot of really valuable things being shared here. But my first knee jerk was like, is this a promo thing for something? Should we be part of this? Can we put ourselves behind this? But I think, it's a valuable thing to connect all these people. And so I'm not critiquing. That was just, I'm being honest. That's what my first.
No, and you should. By the way,
yes. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's not to promote the software, but I mean,
for sure,
we're building an organization
that
has a place in the community. I think, well, I'll let Luke, sorry, Luke, I cut you off and you.
No, I think what I'd want to add is, having done a for-profit and having done a nonprofit, we now have a benefit corporation. And the challenge that I had with our nonprofit was that we were always walking around begging for money. And when we had funding organizations or donors that were interested in what we were doing, it was great, but then we would have a pandemic or we'd have, a catastrophe and the interest went somewhere else. And so, Jesse, I think I think the point, Clint, is as we continue to hone our website and hone our messaging, we have to have people feel very comfortable about who we are and what we are, because we're a for-profit tech company, but we're certainly not Facebook. And
exactly.
I think threading that needle is not an easy choice, but the alternative is frustratingly low amounts of capital to change the world and make it better.
Totally.
My take on that is the challenges for you right now are probably as much about messaging, as you said. So I think that you can bring in more allies. I don't know about, is it possible for you, in other words, if you have a nonprofit arm of the for-profit for certain kinds of work you want to do, that's a longer conversation. I know.
No, that's a structural avenue that's still open to us.
Yeah.
Having started companies, I know how the extreme focus you need just to pull it off.
Yeah.
So we're going to revisit that as a team. Clint and I will take it offline with our advisory board. in Q3 to Q4, and more likely Q4. We'll make a call one way or another on whether or not we want to engage in a sister organization or create a new subsidiary of some kind that's a nonprofit. But we also want to make sure that that's not perceived as a sham either, right? I mean, it's like, okay, what are they hiding? Why did they create this separate organization? Even Salesforce rolled their Salesforce.org back into the company because it was just such a thin veneer over what they were trying to do anyway. So thank you for that. We're not sure yet, but that's something that we're definitely considering.
So the one thing, and I'm really coming from, oh, go ahead, Jesi.
I was just going to say, you deserve to be paid for the work you do, so you can own it too.
Yeah, that's part of the challenge, right? Or part of the plan. Yeah.
Totally.
The part that the not-for-profit really is attractive, though, is when we are asking organizations to grant monies to schools for these PV programs, right? And you know, well, why not have that be a tax deductible grant to the school, right, for that PV program? And so that's where Luke and I, literally, that was a bullet point on our very first conversation.
Yeah.
And it has yet to be closed.
That's great.
All right. Thank you so much.